Welcome to the STARS program, seniors taking active roles in society. And now, here's your host, Anita Finley.
Of course, you've heard Darwin Porter before. He's that fantastic author and someone who we have on our radio show once a month at least. And he's going to be on our show this morning. So let's get right to you, Darwin. Good morning.
Good morning, Anita, and I'll be welcoming you very soon in New York.
I'm so excited. I can't wait, actually. And what's the weather like?
A few winds blowing in from Canada, but otherwise it's just fine. Anita, there's so much I want to talk about. So I want to talk this morning and bring people up to date a little bit on what happened to a little girl named Anne Frances Robbins, born in Flushing, Queens, New York, in 1921, who grew up to become the most powerful woman in the world.
Okay.
And we know her by the name of Nancy Reagan.
Oh, my goodness. Okay.
Who historians say was the most powerful first lady since Eleanor Roosevelt. And some things are going on about her. As you know, I wrote a book called Love Triangle about Ronald Reagan, Jane Wyman, and Nancy Davis. For those who don't remember, Jane Wyman, one of the stars of Golden Age Hollywood, was the first wife of Ronald Reagan. They married in 1940 and divorced in 1948. And then he went on to marry Nancy. Just one thing, a lot of people don't know that she is a New York. She was from New York. And when I was writing my book, I went up to Flushing, Queens, to her childhood home, where she was taken as an infant. It's a very modest place. I discovered in the driveway a van, and I talked to this man in his 60s, and he said he had just pulled he'd been living there in the driveway, and I said, well, the house looked like it was falling in, and I said, does anyone live here now? He said, no, it's just an abandoned house, and I don't know who owns it, but I've decided to live in the driveway, and I don't know what will happen to the house. It might even be turned into a museum. I don't know, but I just thought it was funny that her house was left all alone and abandoned. But the several things I'll just like to make a few comments about the funeral, which was held at the Reagan Library, as you know, in Simi Valley in California, which I'd visited 2 years ago. There were two or three things that happened there that surprised me. One was Ron Reagan Jr. got up, and I've never heard this at a funeral, but he said, my mother could be a pain in the ass.
Oh, goodness.
I thought that went out, broadcast to millions of people around the world, and then he went on to say very complimentary things, but she had a difficult time with her children, and Patty Davis was there, and it was a very religious ceremony, and then Patty said, I'm not one to believe in the supernatural, and of course, by that she meant all the religious about life ever after and all that. In fact, I have a little secret for some people. Nancy said to some close friends, she said, I never believed in life after death until one night, not too many years ago, and she said, I was asleep alone in my bedroom, and I woke up, and she said, Ronnie, she called him, was lying beside me. And she said, I got up and went to the closet and put a blanket over the both of us because it was chilly, and then went back to bed. And she said, then when I woke up the next morning, he was gone, and the blanket was refolded and put back into the closet. So she said, after that, I now believe in an afterlife, and I will be joining Ronnie in heaven. I just thought that was...
It is.
And but now, Ronald Reagan and Nancy Reagan have now entered immortality. And I know that sounds very melodramatic, but it's true. They are now part of history. And history is a terrible judge sometimes. There's been a great cover-up in the life of Nancy and Ronnie, in the sense that they never really wanted their years as a Hollywood star written about. And I understand some people at the Reagan Library are very upset with me for having written a book. I wrote a book not about their political life, but about their movie star life, which is filled with such intrigue. And it is one of the movies possibilities being shopped around now in the Hollywood studios. And along with another one, I don't know if you heard about it, but there was a terrible mistake already. It made front page headlines across America. Will Ferrell, the actor, was shopping this comedy where he made fun of Reagan as having Alzheimer's, and and that drew fierce reaction from Patty and Ron Jr. and many other people. Meaning Alzheimer's is not something that you want to make fun of. And Patty Davis was furious. And the project has now been withdrawn, but it has been recycled and rewritten as a man who first suffered dementia in his final 2 years in office as a prelude to getting Alzheimer's. And it will be treated, if someone buys it, it will be treated as a drama, not a comedy. One of the scenes in it that I've heard about is toward the end when, Reagan did seem to be faltering. For example, at one hearing, he couldn't remember his chief of staff, and that was probably an early sign. But the point was, and this was claimed, and I can't prove it, is that they finally convinced him toward the very end that he was actually playing in a movie, and he had been cast as President of the United States.
Really? Oh, my goodness.
Very, very interesting point. So it's not, I think it probably will be, because, they will now be in the history books. But now back to the cover-up. Nancy said that my life began when I met Ronnie. But, she was already in her 30s. I mean, she had been around the block. She had a very, very active life. Her mother, Edith, was an actress, and so she was eventually born in a trunk, almost like Judy Garland saying and finally dumped with some relatives in Maryland where she grew up. And I must say, Edith was not like her daughter, and thank God she wasn't. Edith was actually quite a racist, and Nancy was not a racist at all. For example, I was talking to, that Eartha Kitt, the singer, was a friend of mine, and I wrote a movie for her one time, and she told me that she was invited when they lived in Chicago to the home of Edith and Loyal, who was the stepfather, Loyal Davis. Nancy took her stepfather's name, Davis, and Edith ran into Carol Channing, and Carol Channing was invited to Edith's home for a party, and Edith said, "Why don't you bring a guest?" And so Edith gave the time, and Carol ran into Eartha Kitt, who was there singing in a club, and said, "Why don't you come to this party with me?" So Carol Channing arrived at the party with Eartha Kitt. And about 10 minutes later, Carol Channing told me that she was called into the toilet and said, Edith said, "Listen, when I told you to bring a guess I didn't mean for you to bring a colored gal. And she says, I'm going to have to ask the two of you to leave the party right away.
Oh, my goodness.
So I'm only telling that story to show that Nancy certainly evolved from her mother's position. Her mother even attacked. Nancy was, famous for wearing the color of red, and her mother even attacked her for that because she said red is just a color that colored people like to wear. So,
my goodness.
Isn't that
yeah, it is.
amazing?
So she grew up in this very right-wing household.
Yes, but, Nancy herself was sort of right-wing, although not, she was not as right-wing as what we see today. For example, she was an advocate of stem cell research because she had a mastectomy in 1987 and then urged all women to get monograms, and she was a pioneer of stem cell research.
Really?
Which Republicans apparently don't like. But now, as far as the story, I hope eventually my book will be maybe done in a documentary on these three people. I am very, very fortunate that I came across information mainly through my former boss who lived in Hollywood and knew Nancy Davis and Jane Wyman and Ronald Reagan, and he worked for Hedda Hopper. Remember her?
Oh, yes.
And he picked up all this information and fortunately turned over boxes of it to me because I may be elderly, but I was not in Hollywood in 1937, and he was. So there's nothing really bad about what they did. They were just, shall we say, they liked to party. All three of them did. And the marriage of Jane Wyman and Ronnie, it really didn't work out. They adopted a child, Michael Reagan, and they had a child of their own, Maureen Reagan, who's now dead. But and Ronnie was in the war propaganda office, but they were involved in other affairs. Reagan had, most people that I've talked to, they picture him as this elderly man, but back in his heyday, Jack Warner, his boss, said, my God, Ronald Reagan is more of a swordsman at Warner's than Errol Flynn, which, considered the conquest Errol Flynn made, was quite something. And oddly enough, Reagan knew this singer from that he had met in Iowa, and he called her up, and she said, well, listen, I can arrange a date for you. You've got 3 days leave here in town. And the date turned out to be Betty Grable, who was a starlet, unknown, relatively unknown. And then, of course, within 2 or 3 years, she became the biggest box office star of World War II and the pinup girl of World War II. And so he got involved with many, many actresses. He said, I developed leading lady-itis, which meant I fell in love with my co-star, but we ended our affair at the end of the movie, and I went on to another movie. But
Darwin, didn't that happen with a lot of stars?
Oh, yes. But what I'm saying is it's just not associated with Ronald Reagan.
Yeah.
You know about Errol Flynn or Peter Lawford or people like that. But, I mean, Reagan has such an image. Of course, the image of the presidency is so strong, and his love affair with Nancy, that you forget he was once a young man. In fact, Jane Wyman had to fight to get him because Susan Hayward, who is one of my favorite stars, Susan Hayward was after him too. And then he got involved with Lana Turner. So I'll tell you, he had good taste, that Mr. Reagan. One part of the script, if they can sell it, in my book. I'm amazed that other writers haven't picked it up. It involves Marilyn Monroe. And Jane Wyman divorced Ronnie because Lou Ayres, her co-star in her Oscar-winning picture, Johnny Belinda, promised to marry her. And then after she divorced Reagan, he said that he changed his mind. And this is how Marilyn Monroe came in. Both Jane Wyman and Marilyn Monroe were after the same man. His name was Fred Cougar, and he was a band leader and a musician. And he had moved Marilyn into his home with his mother and daughter from a previous marriage. And Marilyn fell in love with him, but Jane fell in love with him too. And could you imagine Jane Wyman and Marilyn Monroe fighting over this band leader? Well, Jane won. Fred told Marilyn, "I don't think you're a fit person to be the mother of my daughter," meaning stepmother, of course. And so he went to Jane, and Jane married him. She later divorced him, married him again, and divorced him the second time. But where does Reagan fit into this? Marilyn was, one of her first movies were called Ladies of Burlesque, and the star was one of the blonde beauties of the 40s, named Adele Juergens. And in this movie, Marilyn played the daughter of Adele Juergens, although there was only an 8-year difference. An 8-year difference in their ages. And after leaving Jane, Reagan fell in love with Adele Juergens and had given her a big diamond ring. And one day he came to the studio at 5 o'clock to pick up Adele, and she was tied up in a night shoot. And on the way out, he met a woman who just changed her name to Marilyn Monroe, and she said, Adele's busy tonight, but I really have nothing to do, and maybe you could take me to dinner.
Okay.
And he said yes.
Okay.
So thus began Reagan's affair with Marilyn Monroe. I thought that was interesting how both Jane Wyman and Ronald Reagan somehow got involved with Marilyn.
But Darwin, in your book that was so wonderful, he really had a very nice physique.
Yes, he did. In fact, I once won a show. It was a quiz show about American presidents, and they said, which two American presidents had posed for, nude figure studies for art classes. And I was the third one called upon, and I said, Gerald Ford and Ronald Reagan. And they said, you win!
Gerald Ford also, huh?
Gerald Ford was a very handsome football player and male model. And so was Ronald Reagan. A lot of people don't know that. And that's why I hope that I would like very much to see, I hope a documentary is made on all three of these people because they deserve it, and they are iconic figures. Now, Nancy said her life began when she met Ronnie, but, it really, really didn't. She had a mutual friend named Spencer Tracy. Edith knew all sorts of famous people because she was an actress, her mother. And Spencer Tracy decided to set her up with Clark Gable when he came to New York. And Nancy really wanted to marry Clark Gable, but somehow he drifted off and of course didn't marry her. And her real love was apparently Frank Sinatra. That she had an utter fascination over the years with Frank Sinatra, and Kitty Kelly, in her biography of Nancy, said that Nancy used to entertain Frank at the White House when Reagan was away. And
really?
Take no calls and be locked away for 4 hours. And then Frank did brag about his conquest of Nancy. Now, Frank was not that turned on by Nancy, according to Dean Martin and Sammy Davis Jr., but after the Kennedys kicked him out, he wanted to be a power broker, so he switched his alliance from the Kennedys, Democrats, to Reagan's, the Republicans. And there's a wonderful picture, you may have seen it, at a gala at the White House where Nancy is dancing in the arms of Frank Sinatra, and Reagan cuts in. And, you know, Nancy had that wonderful gazing look at her husband, but at this time she's photographed giving Reagan the glare. You know,
okay.
It was just, Reagan wrote a book about his Hollywood years, and it was called Where's the Rest of Me? That's the most famous line he ever uttered in a movie. It was in King's Row, where this vicious doctor, Charles Coburn, cut off his legs to get, while he was under sedation. His legs were in perfect order, and when he woke up, he realizes that his legs have been amputated, and he said, "Where's the rest of me?" That's and he named. Now, in this biography, we learned very little about his private life. He devoted 3 lines to Jane Wyman. 3 lines. I mean, he was married to her during his most important years in Hollywood as a star, and he devoted most of the space to being the president of the Screen Actors Guild. He didn't look too good to me to that, because he was a secret informant of J. Edgar Hoover, of whom I wrote another book, and he was often turning in dossiers on the more left-wing members. You know, this was during the McCarthy communist witch hunt period that destroyed many careers. And he was also, the unions were striking, and he was a strike breaker himself, and so he earned a lot of animosity during that period. So his book is not so much about his personal life, but about his politics. As most people now know, he was a Democrat, and he even was a Democrat, and he and Lauren Bacall went and campaigned for Harry S. Truman. But when he started working for General Electric, he got in with the General Electric hierarchy, and also Nancy was a very Republican, and people think that Nancy and the General Electric people sort of shifted his his political beliefs. But Reagan might not have married Nancy because he fell in love with a woman who is still alive, the wonderful, wonderful Doris Day, and they had an affair, and he was going to marry her. In fact, his friend George Murphy, who was a movie star and later became senator from California, he said, you know, if you marry Doris and you want to go into politics, she can always come on and sing Sentimental Journey and warm up the audience for you. And then one night Nancy called and said, Ronnie, I'm pregnant.
That did it.
Of course, we're talking about Patty Davis. You know, I've had my newspaper feuds with Patty Davis before.
Oh, yes.
The one thing I thought, there are many things I like about Patty Davis, not what she says about me, but I admire her spunk. The only thing I didn't like, I don't think she had to change her name. I mean, that she was so ashamed of the name Reagan that she had to take her mother's name, but, well, that's her choice, right? And you know that I'm happy, though, that I heard that Patty and her mother finally made up. After years of feuding, they finally made up, and Reagan also became closer to his son, Michael Reagan, who was adopted. Reagan went to visit him at he was speaking at an academy, and his son Michael came up to him, and apparently they hadn't seen each other in several years. And Reagan said, "Who are you?" He said, "I'm Michael. I'm your son."
Oh, my heavens.
And, oh, Michael, you've grown.
Oh, that's bad. Well, you know what? You're going to recognize me and Bill. You're going to recognize us when we get there, and we have just run out of time, Darwin. And it's always funny when people talk about the Reagans, because we got to talk about, all these other people coming up. And your book, Trump, the book on Trump that you're working on, is going to be great. I will see you. Bill and I will see you on Sunday, and we have so much to talk about. And thank you so much.
I am looking forward to it.
We are too, Darwin. Take care of yourself until then.